The dust of Black Creek's main street clung to the air like a shroud, thick with the heat of the day and the ugliness of the moment. It was a stage, and on it stood Ilara, a spectacle arranged by a man whose heart was a shriveled knot of malice. Jedediah Thorne, land baron and town puppeteer, grinned, his teeth a row of yellowed tombstones. He had arranged this union as a cruel joke, a public settling of a debt with the reclusive rancher, Silas Kane. Thorne owed Kane a significant sum, but instead of coin, he had promised him a bride, a helper for his vast, empty homestead. The town, starved for any diversion, had gathered to watch the punchline be delivered. Ilara was the punchline. She was described not by her name, but by her frame, a woman built of sturdier stock than the willows and reeds the men of Black Creek preferred. Her shoulders were broad, her hands capable, her presence a solid fact in a world that preferred feminine whispers. Thorne presented her with a theatrical flourish, his voice dripping with faux generosity. "Silas! As promised. A wife to warm your lonely hearth. Strong, as you can see. Plenty of her to get you through the winter." Laughter, sharp and cruel as broken glass, rippled through the crowd. Ilara stood motionless, her gaze fixed on a loose board in the saloon's porch across the street. She had learned long ago that to look at her tormentors was to give them a piece of her soul. She would not. Her calico dress, clean but worn, felt like a costume for her own humiliation. Then, he appeared. Silas Kane moved through the parting crowd not with aggression, but with an unnerving stillness, a silence so profound it seemed to absorb the jeers and whispers around him. He was a man carved from the unyielding landscape he inhabited, his face a terrain of sun-etched lines and quiet sorrow. His eyes, the color of a stormy sky, passed over Thorne with disinterest, bypassed the sneering faces of the onlookers, and settled on Ilara. He looked not at her size, as the others did, but at the rigid set of her jaw, the tremor in her hand she tried so desperately to still, and the profound, wounded dignity in her downcast eyes. The silence stretched, becoming heavier than the afternoon sun. Thorne's smirk began to falter. This was not the reaction he had anticipated. Silas stopped before her, his shadow falling over her like a shield. He didn't speak. Instead, he simply extended a calloused, scarred hand. It was not a demand, but an offering. A quiet, undeniable invitation to leave this stage of cruelty behind. After a lifetime of being an object of scorn, it was the first time anyone had offered her a choice. Her gaze lifted from the dusty street and met his. In his eyes, she saw not pity, but a flicker of something she couldn't name, a shared understanding of a pain that needed no words. Slowly, deliberately, she placed her hand in his. His grip was firm, solid, a promise of sanctuary. He turned his back to the stunned town, and led her to his wagon, a silent king leading his queen from a court of fools. The journey to Silas's ranch was a study in silence, a long, winding passage through a landscape as stark and withdrawn as the man who commanded the reins. The flat, sun-baked plains gave way to rolling hills scarred with granite and dotted with tenacious, wind-battered pines. The world grew larger, emptier, the sky a vast, indifferent canvas of blue. Ilara sat on the wagon bench, her hands folded in her lap, the dust of her public shaming settling into a layer of grime on her dress. The silence was not uncomfortable, it was a balm after the festering noise of the town. It was a space where she did not have to perform or pretend or shrink herself. Beside her, Silas was a mountain of quietude. He did not look at her. His focus was on the horizon, on the subtle shifts in the land, on the language of the wilderness he knew so well. Yet, she felt his awareness of her, a steady, peripheral presence that was protective rather than predatory. It was a novel sensation, and it unsettled her more than the open hostility she was used to. When they finally crested a large hill, the ranch sprawled below them, a solitary outpost against the immensity of nature. The house was a simple, sturdy structure of dark wood, flanked by a large barn and a series of corrals. It was functional, severe, and utterly devoid of softness. It looked like a place a man went to forget the world, or to be forgotten by it. As Silas pulled the wagon to a halt, the only sound was the sighing of the wind through the eaves of the barn. He dismounted, then turned and offered his hands to help her down, a gesture of practical courtesy that felt like a profound act of grace. He led her inside. The interior mirrored the exterior, meticulously clean, orderly, and deeply impersonal. It was a house, but not a home. It held no memories, no laughter, no warmth. It was a shell. He led her to a room at the back of the house. It was sparse, containing only a simple bed with a neatly folded quilt, a small washstand, and a wooden chest. "This will be yours," he said. His voice was rough, like stones grinding together, a sound unused to forming words. It was the first thing he had said to her directly. Elara looked at the closed door, the single window facing the endless plains, and understood. He was not giving her a bridal chamber, he was giving her a fortress. A space of her own, inviolable and safe. In that moment, a seed of fragile trust, something she thought had died in her years ago, began to push its way through the barren soil of her heart. He had not saved her from humiliation to claim a prize, he had offered her an escape. The days that followed unfolded in a rhythm of quiet labor and mutual distance. A silent pact was formed without a single word being exchanged. He had his world, the world of fences and livestock, of branding irons and the vast, unforgiving range. She had hers, the domestic sphere he had clearly abandoned long ago. She began by transforming the sterile house into a place of life. She scrubbed the floors until the wood gleamed, aired out the dusty linens until they smelled of sun and wind, and polished the few windows until they let in the stark beauty of the landscape. She found a rhythm in the work, a purpose that was her own. She cooked for him, leaving his meals on the table, and he would eat in silence after she had retired to her room. They were two solitary planets orbiting the same sun of shared solitude, their paths parallel but never intersecting. One afternoon, while sweeping the porch, her eyes fell upon a small, derelict patch of earth near the side of the house. It was choked with weeds and littered with stones, a forgotten plot where something had once tried to grow. A memory surfaced, a faint echo from a childhood before she was an orphan, of her mother's hands in the dirt, coaxing life from the soil. An idea, bold and terrifying, took root. The next morning, she began. She cleared the stones, her hands, accustomed to mending and scrubbing, quickly growing raw. She pulled the stubborn weeds, her back aching with the effort. Silas watched from a distance. From the barn door, from the edge of the corral, he would pause in his work, his gaze resting on her small, determined figure. He saw not a bride, but a pioneer, a woman terraforming her own small patch of hope in a desolate land. He said nothing. But one evening, she found a set of well-worn gardening tools, a spade and a hoe, propped against the wall by the back door. They hadn't been there that morning. She knew they were from him. It was a conversation held in the language of action, a dialect they were both fluent in. That night, for the first time, she did not retreat to her room when he came in for his supper. She sat at the far end of the long wooden table, a silent companion in the flickering lamplight. He acknowledged her presence with a slight, almost imperceptible nod. They ate in their customary silence, but it was a different kind of silence now. It was not the silence of strangers, but the shared quiet of two people beginning to build something together, even if they didn't know what it was. The trip to Black Creek was a necessity Silas could no longer postpone. Supplies were dwindling, and the outside world, with its judgments and its cruelty, had to be faced. As the wagon rattled toward town, Elara felt a familiar dread coil in her stomach. The memory of the main street, of the laughter, was a fresh wound. She had found a fragile piece in the isolation of the ranch, and she feared the town would tear it from her. She was not wrong. As they moved down the street toward the general store, the town's collective gaze fell upon them. The whispers started immediately, a sibilant tide of malice. Doors opened a crack. Faces appeared in windows. They were a curiosity, the recluse and his large bride. Jedediah Thorne stood with his cronies outside the saloon, a sneer plastered on his face. He watched them pass, his eyes glittering with a possessive, smug cruelty. He had intended for Silas to be saddled with a burden, to be an object of ridicule. But the man walking beside Elara was not burdened. There was a new stillness about him, a sentinel-like quality. He walked with his back straight, his presence a silent rebuke to the town's pettiness. Inside the general store, the air grew thick with unspoken judgment. The storekeeper served them with a forced, thin-lipped civility. As Elara examined a bolt of plain cotton fabric, one of Thorne's men, emboldened by liquor and his master's proximity, swaggered over. "Well, well," the man slurred, loud enough for the entire store to hear. "Looks like the ranch life agrees with you. Cain must be feeding you well." He gestured crudely at her figure. Elara froze, the fabric clutched in her hand. The familiar heat of shame washed over her. She braced for the impact of the humiliation, a defense she had honed over years. But it never came. Silas, who had been at the counter, turned. He didn't speak. He didn't raise his voice. He simply looked at the man. His eyes, usually the color of a placid storm cloud, were now the color of thunder. They were cold, hard, and utterly devoid of mercy. In that gaze was a promise of swift and terrible violence, a capacity for destruction that was terrifying in its stillness. The man's drunken bravado evaporated. The color drained from his face, and he took an involuntary step back, stammering an apology before practically fleeing the store. Silas's gaze swept over the other silent onlookers, and they suddenly found the floorboards intensely interesting. He paid for their supplies, his movements economical and deliberate. As he guided Elara out of the store, his hand rested for a moment on the small of her back. It was not a romantic touch, but a gesture of pure, unassailable protection. Walking beside him, surrounded by the invisible shield of his strength, Elara felt something she had never felt before in her life. She felt completely and utterly safe. That night, the house on the prairie felt different. The silent understanding between them had been tested and had held firm. After their meal, Elara busied herself mending one of Silas's shirts by the fire, the rhythmic pull of the needle a calming anchor. Silas did not retreat to the barn as he sometimes did. He sat in his chair, watching the flames, but his thoughts were far away, dragged back into the cold waters of his past. The narrator's eye turns inward now, into the desolate landscape of Silas Cain's heart. He was not born to this silence, it was a fortress he had built brick by painful brick. In his hand, hidden from Elara's view, his fingers worried a small, smooth piece of wood. It was a bird, crudely carved, its wings outstretched in a perpetual state of flight. It was the last thing his daughter, Lily, had been holding. The fire in the hearth became another fire, a memory seared into his soul. The smell of smoke, not from pine logs, but from burning dreams. He saw it all with horrifying clarity, the homestead he had built with his own hands, his first home, engulfed in a hell of orange and black. He remembered his wife, Sarah, her face a mask of terror, screaming their daughter's name. He remembered running into the inferno, the heat blistering his skin, the smoke a poison in his lungs. He had found them. But he had been too late. He had carried their lifeless forms from the wreckage of their life, a man carrying the weight of a world that had ended. He had failed to protect them. The grief was not a storm, it was a glacier, freezing him from the inside out. He sold the land, unable to bear the sight of the ashes, and bought this new, isolated ranch, a place so empty it matched the void inside him. He had sought not a new life, but a long, quiet death. He had shut the world out because he believed he had forfeited his right to be a part of it. He had failed in his most sacred duty as a husband and a father. And then came Elara. When he saw her standing in the dust of Black Creek, weathering a storm of humiliation with such profound, quiet strength, he saw a mirror of his own helplessness on that terrible night. He saw an injustice that he could, this time, prevent. Protecting her was not a choice, it was a compulsion, a desperate attempt to right a cosmic wrong, to be the shield he had failed to be for Sarah and Lily. He looked over at Elara, her head bent over her task, her presence a quiet, steady light in the darkness of his home, and he knew that in saving her, he was desperately trying to save himself. The garden became their shared language, the place where their two solitary worlds finally converged. What had started as Elara's desperate act of hope had blossomed into a testament to her resilience. Rows of green shoots pushed through the dark soil, promising beans and squash and hardy root vegetables. A small, stubborn patch of wildflowers she had found seeds for bloomed in a riot of color, a splash of defiant beauty against the muted tones of the prairie. It was more than a garden, it was a declaration that life could flourish even in the harshest of environments. Silas found himself drawn to it. He began to spend the last hour of daylight there, not watching from a distance anymore, but participating. He used his strength to turn the tougher soil she couldn't manage. He dug a small irrigation trench from the well, his engineering practical and precise. One evening, he arrived with rough-sawn lumber and, over the next few days, constructed a sturdy fence around the plot to keep out scavenging animals. He worked with a silent, focused intensity, and she worked alongside him, weeding and watering. They moved around each other with an unspoken choreography, their separate labors weaving together into a single purpose. Their hands would sometimes brush as they reached for a tool or a stone, and a current of warmth would pass between them, an acknowledgement of a bond that was growing as steadily as the plants at their feet. One afternoon, as a storm gathered on the horizon, they worked quickly to secure the more delicate plants. The wind whipped Ilara's hair across her face, and a stray strand caught on a splinter on the new fence post. She tried to pull it free, but it held fast. Before she could become flustered, Silas was there. He moved with a surprising gentleness, his large, calloused fingers working with surgical precision to untangle the strand of hair. For a moment, his hand cupped the side of her head, his thumb resting near her temple. It was the most intimate touch they had ever shared. Their eyes met, and in that instant, the space between them shimmered with a new and potent emotion. The sky broke then, and the rain came down in a torrent, but they barely noticed. He had not just freed her hair, he had touched her face with a tenderness she had never known, a tenderness that spoke of a deep and burgeoning affection. They ran for the house together, laughing, the sound strange and wonderful in the quiet home. The garden had brought more than just vegetables, it had brought the promise of a harvest of the heart. News in a small town like Black Creek travels on the wind, and the winds that blew from Silas Kane's ranch carried a story that Jedediah Thorne found deeply offensive. The tale was not of misery and ridicule, as he had so carefully designed. It was a story of a flourishing garden, of a silent man who now had a protective fire in his eyes, and of a woman who walked with a newfound confidence. His cruel, public joke had not only failed, it had backfired spectacularly. He had meant to give Silas a burden, but he had given him a partner. He had meant to break Ilara's spirit, but he had placed her in the one place on earth where it could heal and thrive. Thorne's ego, a brittle and bloated thing, could not withstand it. Their quiet happiness was a personal affront, a public refutation of his power. He saw it as defiance. In the smoky confines of the saloon, surrounded by the sycophants who orbited his wealth, his anger festered, stoked by whiskey and wounded pride. He decided that if they would not be miserable by his design, he would deliver misery to them by force. He would tear down the little world they were building. He would remind Silas Kane who held the power in this county, and he would put that larger woman back in her place, a place of fear and submission. He rallied his men, a handful of drunk and directionless ranch hands who mistook his cruelty for strength. "We're going to pay a visit to the happy couple," Thorne announced, his voice slurring with malice. Teach them a lesson about gratitude. He wanted to destroy not just their peace, but the very symbol of it. He wanted to salt the earth of their happiness, to trample the defiant beauty they had cultivated. His target was not just the man and the woman, but the garden. He wanted to turn their small patch of paradise back into the desolate, weed-choked plot it had been, to prove that nothing beautiful could grow in his shadow. They mounted their horses, a posse fueled by cheap liquor and malice, and rode out into the encroaching dusk, a storm of human ugliness moving toward the quiet sanctuary on the prairie. The setting sun painted the sky in shades of blood and rust, a fitting backdrop for the destruction they intended to unleash. They arrived like a plague, a noisy, drunken intrusion into the sacred quiet of the twilight. The sound of their horses and their loud, jeering laughter was a violation of the peace that had settled over the ranch. Ilara was in the garden, gathering the last of the herbs she would need for supper when she heard them. Her blood ran cold. She straightened up, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs, and saw Thorne and his men ride directly toward her, their faces twisted into ugly masks of bravado. They didn't even bother with the house. They rode their horses straight through the new wooden fence, splintering the lumber Silas had so carefully erected. They plunged into the garden, a deliberate, brutal assault on the life she had nurtured. The horses' hooves were instruments of destruction, churning the soft earth, trampling the tender bean shoots, crushing the vibrant heads of the wildflowers. Laughter echoed in the twilight as they tore through the rows, their casual violence a physical manifestation of their contempt. Elara stood frozen, a small basket of herbs dropping from her numb fingers. It was a desecration. They were destroying more than plants, they were destroying her hope. They were stomping on the first true happiness she had ever known, grinding it into the dirt with malicious glee. Thorne dismounted, a whip in his hand, and strode toward her, his boots crushing a squash vine. "Look at this mess," he said, feigning sympathy. "All that hard work for nothing. Some things just aren't meant to grow out here." He looked her up and down, his gaze lingering on her with a predatory ownership. "And some people aren't meant to be happy. It's an unnatural state of affairs. I'm just here to restore the balance." He took another step toward her, raising the whip slightly, not to strike, but to intimidate, to menace. Elara flinched, taking a step back, her foot sinking into the mud where a row of carrots had been only moments before. She looked past him, her eyes pleading toward the barn, where Silas had been mending a harness. For a moment, there was nothing. Just the sound of the wind, the cruel laughter, and the tearing of her world. Then, the barn door slid open with a low groan, and a shadow emerged, a figure of absolute, terrifying stillness. Silas stepped out of the barn and into the twilight, and the world seemed to fall silent. The laughter of Thorne's men died in their throats. The air grew cold. He was no longer the quiet, withdrawn rancher. He was an elemental force, an avatar of judgment. His eyes, fixed on the scene of destruction, were not the color of a storm, they were the storm itself. He saw the splintered fence, the trampled earth, the crushed life. He saw the whip in Thorne's hand. And he saw the terror on Elara's face. In that single, crystallized moment, the glacier of his grief shattered, and a river of fire, the rage and sorrow he had suppressed for years, was unleashed. He did not shout. He did not run. He walked forward, his pace deliberate, each step an earthquake. The first of Thorne's men who tried to block his path was dispatched with a single, brutal blow, a punch that landed with the finality of a hammer striking an anvil. The man crumpled to the ground, unconscious before he even landed. A second man swung a bottle at him. Silas moved with a speed that was preternatural, catching the man's wrist, twisting it until the bone snapped with a sickening crack. The man screamed, a high, thin sound that was quickly silenced as Silas drove him to his knees. The fight was not a brawl, it was a reckoning. It was the righteous fury of a man who had lost everything, now protecting the one thing he had left to live for. He moved through Thorne's men with a terrible, precise grace, his fists and feet instruments of a long-overdue justice. He broke bones, shattered egos, and dismantled their drunken courage piece by piece, leaving them groaning and broken in the ruined soil of the garden. Then only Thorne was left. The whip looked like a child's toy in his trembling hand. Fear, stark and primal, had replaced the sneer on his face. Silas stopped before him, his chest heaving, his face a mask of cold fury. He didn't touch him with his fists. His punishment for Thorne was to be more profound. He simply took the whip from Thorne's unresisting hand, his grip like iron. Then he looked at Thorne, and for the first time, he spoke, his voice a low, terrifying growl. "Get off my land." He didn't need to raise his voice. The command was absolute. Thorne, stripped of his power, his men, and his dignity, scrambled backward like a crab, falling over his own feet in his haste to obey. He fled, a broken, humiliated coward, his reign of casual cruelty ended forever in the dirt of a trampled garden. The aftermath was a profound silence, broken only by the whimpering of Thorne's defeated men and the lonely cry of the wind. Silas stood in the wreckage, his knuckles bleeding, his breathing slowly returning to normal. The firestorm of his rage had passed, leaving behind the quiet ache of its passage. He looked at the devastation, at the ruin of what he and Elara had built, and a deep weariness settled over him. From the porch, Sheriff Brody watched the last of Thorne's men limp away. He had arrived minutes earlier, drawn by the commotion, but had remained a silent observer, recognizing the unfolding of a justice that was older and purer than any law he could enforce. He was a world-weary man who understood that some accounts could only be settled in blood and dirt. He walked over to Silas, his gaze taking in the scene. He nodded slowly. "Looks like the trash took itself out," he said, his voice dry as dust. "Don't expect you'll be bothered by him again." It was an absolution, a recognition of the righteousness of Silas's actions. With another nod, the sheriff turned and left, leaving them to the quiet of their reclaimed sanctuary. Ilara approached Silas slowly. She didn't look at the ruined garden. She looked at him, at the raw, bloody knuckles of the hand that had defended her. She took his hand in both of hers, her touch gentle, and led him inside. By the light of the fire, she cleaned his wounds, her movements as tender and sure as when she worked in her garden. The silence between them was no longer one of distance, but of deep, shared understanding. When she was done, he did not pull his hand away. He turned it over and enclosed hers in his grip. He looked at her, and his eyes were clear, the long storm in them finally over. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the small, carved wooden bird, placing it in her palm. "Her name was Lily," he said, his voice thick with unshed tears. "My wife was Sarah." He told her everything. He spoke of the fire, of the grief that had hollowed him out, of the silent penance he had been serving for years. He told her how her own quiet strength had been a light in his darkness, how her defiance in planting a garden in his barren world had taught him that life could grow again. He had protected her, but she, with her gentle spirit and indomitable will, had saved him. They stood together by the window, looking out at the trampled earth, at the ruins of their shared project. But they did not see an end. They saw a beginning. They saw the fertile ground, now cleared of its poison, waiting to be replanted. The story of what happened at the Cane Ranch became a local legend, a cautionary tale whispered in hushed tones about the fury of a quiet man. But for Silas and Ilara, it was simply the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. In the days that followed, they rebuilt the fence, stronger this time. Together, they turned the soil, picked out the last of the debris, and replanted, their shared labor a prayer for the future. The house, once a shell of a man's grief, was now filled with the quiet murmur of their life together. It was a home. The true measure of a person's worth is not found in the shape of their body or the approval of a crowd, but in the strength of their spirit and the depth of their heart. You see, the world is full of people like Jedediah Thorne, those who find pleasure in the humiliation of others, who use cruelty as a substitute for strength. But there are also people like Silas and Ilara, who find in each other a sanctuary from that cruelty. They show us that the most beautiful things can grow in the most unlikely of places, and that true royalty is not a matter of birth or title, but of how we treat one another. It's the quiet dignity we afford the wounded, and the fierce protection we offer the vulnerable. What do you think is the greatest measure of a person's character? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more stories that explore the depths of the human heart.